Good morning. Thank you for joining us. My name is Malkia Higgins. I serve as the Director of Public Affairs for Student Government on North Campus, and we're also happy that you tuned in to celebrate Constitution Day with us. This federal holiday honors the signing of the U.S. Constitution on September 17, 1787, and is considered one of the most important and significant days in American history. We celebrate Constitution Day in remembrance of the brave and patriotic men and women who fought for freedom and established framework to govern this country, and to also honors those who have chosen to become U.S. citizens. On behalf of student government, we encourage you all to continue to celebrate this holiday in ways like simply hanging the American flag outside your home, reading and learning more about the Constitution and your rights, and of course, if you have not already, by registering to vote in the 2020 election. Your voice is more important now than ever before. As college students, we have such a unique opportunity to have our voices heard, and so register to vote at browardsoe.org. Now, we have two special guests with us today. We have Professor Bakaran and Professor Jean Bart, and Professor Bakaran will be the first one to be speaking with us today, and I will be giving a brief introduction of him. So Professor Bakaran is currently an instructor of African American Studies at Central Connecticut State University, where he initiated, developed, and coordinated a civil rights project. He also serves as an instructor of political science at Quinnipiac, did I say that right?
You got it.
University, the University of Connecticut Post University and Capital Community College. Before launching his academic career, Mr. Balkaran worked for the African National Congress, Nelson Mandela's running party in South Africa, in partnership with the University of Connecticut. He was also a research associate for the United Nations in New York and was a former aide to the Connecticut Secretary of State. He has authored 8 books, namely America's Promise, Chasing the Dream of Civil Rights, Introduction to African American Studies, a reader, Broken Promises, Broken Dreams, Disparities and Disappointments, Civil Rights in the 21st Century, Before We Are Called Hispanics, Conversations on the Politics, Race and Immigration Reform, The Continuing Significance of Race, An American Dilemma, and Retracing the Civil Rights Movement. His 9th and forthcoming book is entitled Trouble in Paradise, The African American Experience in Key West. He has also authored over 70 articles in academic journals, magazines, and on race relations, diversity and inclusion, American foreign policy, and public policy. He has also given over 100 speeches on his research, publications, and books throughout the United States. Professor Balkaran's educational background spans from the Presentation College in Trinidad, the University of Connecticut, and Quinnipiac University School of Law, including fellowships at Yale University and Harvard University. Mr. Balkaran currently resides in West Hartford, Connecticut, USA. Professor Balkaran.
Thank you, guys. Thank you for the opportunity to be here. I also live in Western Florida. For those who don't know me, and my students will tell you, I go back and forth between Connecticut and obviously Western. So I'm delighted to be here among all the distinguished scholars and students and Professor Bart here at the South Campus. Talk about obviously the Constitution. This great document we all talk about in so many capacities. And I had an opportunity to dialogue with a couple of my colleagues in law school, even back in Connecticut, where I teach at the university, and I'm also a part-time faculty here, working with Professor King and Tony Lewis, who should be also complimented for putting this project together. And one of the things that always fascinated me was the U.S. Constitution, even my days some 20 years ago in law school. Being an African-American studies scholar and writing extensively on race in America, I was always intrigued about the Constitution and race, and obviously some of the racist laws that was perpetuated in this country. So with that being said, the Constitution is a phenomenal document. And I say that because emerging democracies throughout the world always look back at 2 major documents in the United States to kind of set the platform and obviously the foundation of their democracy. 1 being the Declaration of Independence and 2 being the U.S. Constitution. So these 2 documents, becomes foundation of modern democracies. And as we articulate this dialogue, countries are following the backbone of American democracy. But I often question this idea of democracy because I found it to be strange in a country where certain ethnic groups were often excluded from opportunities from mainstream white America. And the Constitution becomes an important document that has prevented, especially African Americans, from achieving many of what you call the American dream. So began researching the Constitution 20 plus years ago, and some of my classes at the university, at Quinnipiac University, and also at Central Connecticut State, revolves around African American politics, and one of my courses is law and slavery. So that being said, I wanted to address today's speech and today's lecture, today's discussion on looking at the role of the Constitution and the institution of slavery. And what's interesting about this document is that, was it a pro-slavery document? Was it not a slavery document? So many scholars articulate this scholarship on this document called the U.S. Constitution. So I will try my best to break it down in the 15, 20 minutes that I have to speak today, looking at this document, tracing back our history, and obviously to see what element obviously took place. So if you go back to where I live in the state of Connecticut in 1776, obviously the Declaration of Independence, one major concept that came out of the whole Revolutionary War was actually two major things. One, what do we do with the Black people in the United States? And two, what do we do with the institution of slavery? So I start off my lecture with a very important quote in 1776. When asked by the founding fathers, when asked about slavery, Thomas Jefferson, who architected, obviously, the Declaration of Independence, he was not part of the U.S. Constitution. He was actually the ambassador to France. Jefferson and the Constitution, in the eyes of African Americans and slavery perpetuated, is a contradiction for what this country stands for. So if you look at the Constitution, those who have me for a con law and American politics at Broward, we talk about the foundations of democracy. One of the core contexts that come out of the Constitution is what he called equal justice before the law. Well, if you look at the history of African Americans, and obviously this summer Black Lives Matter, equal justice before the law was never manifested or perpetuated by this great document called the U.S. Constitution. So coming back to constitutionalism, Thomas Jefferson, when asked in 1776 about obviously the institution of slavery and what do we do with Black people, his remarks in 1776, and I quote, simply said, it's too good of a deal, end quote. He's saying, class, that slavery is too good of a deal and it will be absolutely nonsense or rubbish to get rid of the institution of slavery. When asked about slavery and the founding of the new republic in 1776, the architect of the U.S. Constitution, James Madison said in 1776, class, this country will never work. This country will never work. So we started off with this foundation, obviously, of this great country, looking how do we build America on the backbone of the institution of slavery and African Americans. And as a result, throughout the history all the way to 2020, this great US document has always perpetuated racism, has always perpetuated white supremacy. And as a result, we have seen the continued divide in this country when it comes to Black and white, primarily on the back of the US Constitution. So the idea of democracy, the idea of constitutionalism, the idea of what this great document says in context has never been extended, obviously, to African Americans. So as a result, I start off with my lecture with a quote taken in 1832 by William Lloyd Garrison, a famous abolitionist movement in New England and throughout the United States. If you look at the history back all the way to 1860, the foundation of American history was based on two political philosophies coming from the Constitution. What are those? One, how do we keep the Union intact? Two, without disturbing the institution of slavery. So William Lloyd Garrison, in many of your history classes or African American history classes at Broward or FIU, I start with this quote. And he talks about the US Constitution in great context. And what he has said, class, simply, and I quote, he says the compact, the US Constitution was a compact between the northern states and the southern states. It's a covenant with debt. And it's an agreement, class, made with hell. He said America is going straight to hell, end of quote. So what the US Constitution is, simply argued by many of us who teach African American studies and race relations and law and slavery, it was a compromise between northern states and southern states over the institution of slavery. The country could not be founded, could not move on. Once we became a country, what do we do with the Black people? And as a result, the Constitution became the compromise. Northern states wanted something and Southern states wanted something. And as a result, that's what gave rise to the Constitution. If you study African American philosophy and political theory, you'll probably read a guy called Frederick Douglass, probably the most profound American scholar ever. Douglass has written numerous books, obviously, taught at Harvard and Yale as a lecturer, given speeches in England. But he writes, obviously, an important speech called the 4th of July speech, written in 1854, where he clearly attacks the US Constitution and the Declaration of Independence. And what he said in this particular speech is that America was false to his promise, false to his past, and false to his future. That this country was built on fake promises and false promises when it came to, obviously, the rights you guys probably have learned in your classes and your courses that is given to us by the US Constitution. Those rights were only extended to, obviously, whites. African Americans were not even citizens until the 13th Amendment, 14th Amendment, 1868. So again, look at the Constitution and how it's shaped and deformed, okay? It's formed in a way that obviously certain groups benefited from this country. So what do we have post-1787? It's important when you study law and study slavery and constitutionalism to understand the 55 delegates that went to the convention. 27 of those delegates owned African Americans or owned slaves. The other 28 who came from the North indirectly benefited from slavery. And when I say indirectly, they own factories and mills and bought textiles and they own clothing companies and so forth. So as a result, both groups, both 55 delegates, clearly in every way, shape, and form benefited from the institution of slavery. So here they are in Philadelphia trying to articulate a document that will make a compromise between the northern state over the southern states, obviously over slavery. Not one of those individuals had any intention of getting rid of slavery. Okay, it was too good of a deal, as Jefferson said, and this Madison said, this country will never work. This country will never work. So as a result, we had the 55 delegates getting together, obviously, in Philadelphia. Now, what's interesting about this particular document is that there is not one word of slavery mentioned in the US Constitution. It was cleverly constructed, obviously, by the founding fathers to make sure that obviously slavery is not mentioned. And that's how they got it wrong with all the compromises as we kind of grew as a country. But as the Missouri Compromise, the Compromise of 1850, the Dred Scott case and so forth, what do we do with the Black people? What do we do with slavery? And as a result, compromises will become an essential part of our history. If you look at perpetuation, I want to go back to one of my slides. What it did, class, it created two things in America. One, an institution of slavery, perpetuated, but it claimed and created an ideology of white supremacy and Black inferiority, perpetuated by the US Constitution and also case law, as the Supreme Court has ruled in 1847 and 1896 in Plessy versus Ferguson and the Dred Scott case, which I'll talk probably a little later on. It perpetuated, class, the sense of white supremacy and Black inferiority in this country. So to articulate where I am right now in a dialogue, this great document that we take pride and we celebrate and acknowledge, and emerging democracies build their countries on the US Constitution, the foundations anyhow, this document is not all that great. Because if you look at racism in America, you could directly trace it back to the US Constitution. Though slavery is not mentioned, northern states and southern states had to come to a compromise in order to get this country going. So how is slavery manifested in the US Constitution? Well, number one, it talks about the 3-5 compromise. 3-5, 2-5 rule, African Americans with 3-5, 2-5 property business people. We created our electoral system, the Electoral College, based on the 3-5, 2-5 compromise. Southern states wanted more political votes, more congressmen in DC based on the population. And northern states said, no, no, no. African Americans are property, they're not people. Why are we considering them, property? If you own property, you have to pay more taxes. And as a result, we have the 3-5 compromise that still exists today. Our system of government is clearly on the backbone of the institution of slavery. Number two, the 1808 compromise in the U.S. Constitution. Have a chance to read that if you have a chance. It talks about obviously, the importation of Africans will start 1808, and what that did is the importation of persons. Now, who are we importing? Back in the 1780s, 1800s, 1805. Are we importing Irish or Jewish or Polish folks? No, we are importing African Americans or Africans. But the document clearly says, the importation of persons. The slave trade is what manifested that particular element in the Constitution. And then the 1791 Fugitive Slave Clause mentioned in the U.S. Constitution that clearly articulates people escaping from the South. It doesn't mention slavery, but persons who are escaping from the South, moving to the North, who are caught, have to be returned back to their rightful owner. Well, who's escaping from the South? Are white folks escaping from the South? No. Are African Americans escaping? Yes, they're escaping up from the South to the North, the Mason-Dixon line, to secure freedom. So if you look at those contexts mentioned in the U.S. Constitution, it clearly articulates, obviously, that this was a slave document. This document wasn't as great as we praise it. What it was a document between northern states and southern states to obviously articulate, how this country will move and how this country was formed. And as a result, slavery is not mentioned in the Constitution all the way until 1865, until we drafted and amended the 13th Amendment. So what did this document do at this time frame? Well, it created obviously a culture of white supremacy, a culture of hatred, a culture of racism, depicted and endorsed by the U.S. Constitution. Depicted and endorsed by the U.S. Constitution. In fact, Professor Amir Ali, Yale Law School, clearly articulates this in one of his books where he says, class, the framers embraced, and I quote, this concept of Black inferiority, enshrined in the power of the slaveholders and the racist ideas in the nation's founding document, end of quote. Yale professor Akil Amar talks about that. This is what it was. It was obviously a document on slavery. In 1857, the Dred Scott case, where the U.S. Supreme Court looked at the Constitution, those who read law cases with me, and articulated that African Americans will never become citizens of the United States. The intent of the framers in 1787 didn't include Black people. And as a result, Black people have no rights in which a white man was bound to respect. That is the ruling from the Dred Scott case in 1857. African Americans are not considered citizens of the United States. Whether you're free in the North, like where I live in Connecticut, or whether you're enslaved in the South, the southern states, including Florida, they are not citizens, and therefore they have no rights in which a white man was bound to respect. Those are the words of Chief Justice Roger Taney, who articulated, class, one of the most detrimental Supreme Court decisions that really perpetuated this idea of race and slavery in the U.S. Constitution. African Americans have no rights in which a white man was bound to respect. And if you look at 2020, the Black Lives Matter, these things are still continuing to happen in the United States. The ideas of the Constitution is obviously continuing to happen in the United States. I take a quote from Justice Joseph Story. He's the founder of Harvard Law School back in the 1890s, Supreme Court Justice. And he said, class, in one of his books written, I think in 1900, turn of the century, he says the great purpose of the Constitution was to necessitate the making of the various guarantees to the slave-holding interests, who might otherwise have refused the invitation into the Union, end of quote. Northern states, southern states, the great divide over the institution of slavery, and therefore that one document we talk about was the compromise, was the US Constitution, which was the compromise northern states got together. We see, class, throughout our history, Plessy versus Ferguson in 96, where the US Supreme Court ruled again that segregation of Black people in the United States falls within the boundaries of the Constitution and did not violate the 14th Amendment, which is the Equal Protection Clause. And we've had segregation all the way to the 1960s. Whites only, colors only, perpetuated and endorsed by the US Constitution. So again, look at some of the things that we're talking about. The Bill of Rights, same thing. If you look at fundamental cases, case law, not only among African Americans, but also among Japanese American, in 1943, the internment, you may have read in your high school class or U.S. history classes, the court had ruled in Habashi versus United States that the internment was perfectly legal. If you look at, obviously, Lynn versus rights, Asian Americans, and citizenship, denial of Japanese American citizenship, and the exclusion, the Chinese Exclusion Act fall within that concept, where only white people, according to the Constitution, were allowed to be citizens of this country, including my family who came from the Caribbean. We all have citizenship, like everyone in this class. But, you know, the Constitution at some point prevented class, certain ethnic groups from achieving this whole idea of Americanism in the United States. Chief Justice, in the last, before I conclude my lecture, Thurgood Marshall, first African-American Associate Justice, U.S. Supreme Court. He led the civil rights movement, led the NAACP movement in civil rights by dismantling, obviously, Jim Crow and segregation in the court system, while Dr. King had the church-based movement. The NAACP and the Northern-based movement was a legal movement, which he challenged the U.S. Constitution in the Supreme Court. And one of the things Justice Marshall said that always intrigued me in one of my lectures throughout the country, he says, from the start, class, the document, the U.S. Constitution, was defective from the start, requiring several amendments, the Civil War, social transformation, to attain a system of constitutional government, and its respect for the individual freedoms and human rights as we hold fundamental today. It was defective from the start. It was a slave document created by northern states and southern states to keep the institution of slavery going and to perpetuate racism, second-class status that has been manifested by public policies in this country, manifested by the judicial court decision, Dred Scott, Plessy versus Ferguson, and so forth. So as a result, I'm coming back to all my lectures. And the last point I want to talk about is obviously looking at Dr. Martin Luther King. And Dr. King is always fascinated me because I was telling my class, you know, he lived in Connecticut. He lived in the town that I live in, Connecticut. And he was assassinated on April 3rd, 1968, which was a Thursday. But the night before he was killed, he was writing a speech he was going to give on a Sunday. And that speech was titled, "Why America Will Go to Hell." Dr. Martin Luther King. He never gave that speech afterwards he was killed. So he became very critical of the Constitution. He became very critical and frustrated with America and obviously how African Americans were treated based on the principles and the constitutionalism of the US Constitution. So Dr. King said in that speech on April 3rd, 1968, before he was assassinated, he said, class, "All I say to America," and I quote, "is be true to what you say on paper. If you lived in Russia or lived in China or any totalitarian system, maybe I could understand these illegal injunctions. Maybe I could understand the denial of certain basic rights, First Amendment privileges. But I haven't committed themselves to that yet. But somehow and somewhere I read," he says, class, "that we have the freedom to assembly, the freedom of speech, freedom of press. Somewhere I read the greatest of America is the right to protest. All we are asking America is for our constitutional right." End of quote. Dr. Martin Luther King giving a speech the night before he was assassinated. And he's criticizing this US Constitution. So when emerging democracies use the Declaration of Independence, when they use the US Constitution as the foundation of their new democracy, it's always important that we stand and look at the other side of the US Constitution with regard to African Americans, regard to slavery, regard to racism, regarding to white supremacy, regarding equal justice before the law, which is a core concept of the great document. If you look at 21st century, 2020, this summer, we see Black Lives Matter articulated throughout the country, and they are challenging the Constitution for their fundamental rights, equal justice before the law, that has never been granted to African Americans. So in other words, as I conclude my speech, the US Constitution, class, in the eyes of African Americans and eyes of many scholars, was a compromise over northern states, between the northern states, and the southern states, over the institution of slavery. Go back to the words of Thomas Jefferson and slavery. He said this country and slavery, I'm sorry, it's too good of a deal. James Madison, who architected the Constitution, said, this country will never work. It will never work. End of quote. The compromise between northern states and southern states over the institution of slavery. Remember the 55 delegates who got there, 27 owned slaves, 28 did not, but indirectly benefited from the institution of slavery. So this document created white supremacy, racism, biases, and exclusion from many of the opportunities that African Americans, were not ever given an opportunity to achieve in this country. In fact, this document, in the eyes of African American scholars, is a document of contradiction. Let me give you one more last piece before I conclude. Thomas Jefferson, who architects the Declaration of Independence, he's writing this great document in the morning, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, all men are created equal, and so forth. But Jefferson, at the same time, ladies and gentlemen, owns 400 slaves. While he's writing the Declaration of Independence in the morning, history will show this. Go to Monticello and look at the records. You will see it. He's buying and selling slaves in the afternoon. Okay? So again, some of the contradiction. So I thank you for the opportunity. I'll look forward to answering any questions, and I look forward to joining my colleague, Professor Rudy Bart, in the dialogue. Thank you, guys.
All right, thank you so much, Professor Balkaran. I am going to be introducing our second speaker, and then once he is finished, we'll also have that Q&A, so stay tuned for that. Now, we have Professor Rudy Jean Bart, and that is going to be our next speaker. Professor Rudy Jean Bart is a native of Miami, Florida. He is an assistant professor of history at Broward College's South Campus, where he teaches American history and African American history. Jean Bart was the 2015-2016 Broward College South Campus Professor of the Year. He is the founder and CEO of Rudy Jean Bart, Inc., which affords him the opportunity to do motivational speeches as well as presentations discussing education, entrepreneurship, history, and race. In 2017, Rudy was allotted the opportunity to be a fellow of the Broward County chapter of the New Leaders Council. In May of 2018, Professor Jean Bart became a TEDx speaker as he spoke on the subject, The Pseudoscience That Can Kill My Son. Jean Bart was a Broward College Aspen Faculty Innovation Grant recipient during the 2017-2018 academic year and the Innovative Grant in the academic year of 2018-2019, so 2 years consecutively. In 2019, he was awarded the Gaddis Corporation Endowed Teaching Chair. In 2020, Rudy launched January 1st Productions, which is a podcast network. Its first podcast, Life's Classroom, launched in April and is available on many platforms. Professor Jean Bart was also recently selected by Legacy Magazine as one of South Florida's 40 under 40 Black leaders of today and tomorrow for 2020. Now I present to you Professor Jean Bart.
Thank you so much, Malkia, for that introduction. Professor Balkaran, thank you so much. Actually, the quote that you shared at the end is literally what I was going to reference, so I'm going to have to pivot a little bit now. And so one of the things that I do want to, though, pick up, by the way, shout out to, all the students who are here. I know several of my students are here, and shout out and love to Professor Balkaran students and all those who have joined us today. My guy, Ed Luna, I see you, sir. I see you. Okay, I'm timing myself, so I'll make sure I'm within the 15-minute window. I want you to again travel and think about April 3rd, 1968. King had been involved in this kind of work for 12 and a half years at that particular moment. What we find is a man who is exhausted. He had traveled over 6 million miles. He had delivered about over 2,500 speeches. And he finds himself in Memphis, Tennessee. Why Memphis? Because there was a sanitation workers, two of them, Echo Cole and Robert Walker, two African-American men who were given a malfunctioning truck. The issue in Memphis had been that African-American garbage workers had been given inferior trucks in comparison to their white counterparts. And so because of that, they consistently found themselves with malfunctioning trucks. And in this particular instance, these two individuals died. You had it where there was a strike from the sanitation workers, the African-American sanitation workers. They had determined enough is enough, and naturally, King finds himself a part of this particular fight. He was to speak at the Mason Temple Church on April 3rd, 1968, but he goes instead, sends his best friend and confidant, Ralph Abernathy, to go in his stead to speak to the people. What's interesting is that when Abernathy gets there and it becomes apparent to the masses that King has no intention of going there that evening due to him being under the weather and due to him being exhausted, Abernathy is forced to call King and say to him, you must come to the people tonight because they don't want to hear from me. They have made it abundantly clear they want to hear from you. So King drags himself from his hotel motel room, the same motel that he would be assassinated the very next day. And he ends up sharing a speech that is often known as the mountaintop speech or the promised land speech. And the way in which he ends that speech, he goes, like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place, but I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will. And he's allowed me to go up to the mountain, and I've looked over and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. And he continues and says how his eyes has seen the glory and the coming of the Lord. King is a preacher, right? But King also has a base in which he can expound his thoughts on and move forward on. So the one in which Dr. Baccarat had mentioned before, where he says, all we say to America is be true to what you said on paper. Understand that African Americans are emboldened to fight for rights because they see these rights existing elsewhere. Just this morning, I was sharing with my students the idea that you only fight for rights if you know that there is a collective that has rights themselves. In other words, if everyone doesn't have these rights, then it becomes a collective movement, if you will. A declaration of independence. So the colonies, for example, conjoined in 1776. They declare their independence. Who are they declaring their independence from? They are declaring their independence from England. That is a collective movement. They're trying to fight to exist as a nation, but that is not necessarily the same as civil rights. But civil rights are fought for. Women's rights, as an example, are fought for because they were seen that there were men who had, in particular white men, had the ability to vote. So they met in Seneca Falls of 1848. So Black folk in America find themselves fighting for rights because these words exist on paper. It's a framework that does exist. And so when King originally talks about in that particular speech, the one that he delivers the night before he dies, it is very important to reference this, that he says within that speech, we are saying that we are determined to be men. We are determined to be people. We are saying that we are God's children and that we don't have to live like we are forced to live. We are determined to be men. We are determined to be people. In the protest for sanitation workers to get their rights, one of the signs would say, I am a man. So what were they really fighting for? They were fighting, in essence, was not just simply rights. They were fighting for rights that belong to humans. Black folk find themselves fighting for their humanity. The preamble of the Constitution says, we, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote and general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. We, the people. And yet, what do we find in the Constitution? Though slavery is not mentioned whatsoever, in order for there to be an agreement as it relates to population, there is, as Dr. Baccarat had mentioned, 3/5 compromise that deems that slaves were 3/5 of a human being in order to increase the population of the South, but not recognize the full humanity of slaves, because the northern states understood and recognized that these slaves were not seen as human, definitely not by their southern slave master, that this was just a ploy in order to get more power as it relates to governance. What we find throughout the history of the African American experience is simply a right to be seen and appreciated as human. So here we have it, that when King mentions this speech the night before he dies, I want for you to think about how has it been evident that African Americans were not seen as human? Give me a sense, if you will, right, Professor Jean-Bart, I get it. Give me an example, a story maybe. And what role did these African Americans, though, play in the shaping of America, in the moving forward of America? I think about a few. One that comes to mind is the story of a man by the name of James Armistead. Armistead was a slave. He had determined that he wanted to participate in the Revolutionary War. Many slaves fought on behalf of the British because the British had offered them freedom should they join them in their efforts to defeat America in their quest for independence. But for whatever particular reason, James Armistead had determined that he wanted to fight on behalf of America. He goes to a slave master because he doesn't own himself. He's not seen as human, and asks him, may I be a servant and help this fledgling country be able to declare its independence? Slave master agrees, and so Armistead finds himself serving as a spy under the auspices of Marquis de Lafayette, a French general, 19 years old, who was there to help America in their quest for independence. And Lafayette would use Armistead as a spy, so Armistead would act as though he was working on behalf of the British. And so he was a servant to Lord Cornwallis and his troops. But in the meantime, this slave, this person who was deemed as not being human, this person who in 1787 will be considered 3/5 of a human being, this person had the intellect to be able to gain intel, to know the whereabouts of Lord Cornwallis, to know about some of their plans. And he goes back and reports that they are in Yorktown, that it is possible to surround them. And so George Washington and his forces and Marquis de Lafayette and his forces end up surrounding Lord Cornwallis, and Lord Cornwallis has no choice but to surrender. And when he surrenders, England, therefore, has no choice but to acquiesce and surrender and lose the war. And so what I'm telling you is that America wins the war by winning the Battle of Yorktown. And the Battle of Yorktown is won because of a slave named James Armistead. And the question is, how many of you who have not been in my class before have ever heard that name? Why was he not mentioned? Why is he not referenced in the annals of history like George Washington and others? And there is no constitution and there is no ideals as it relates to freedom had it not been for James Armistead. We understand that the Boston Massacre was one that essentially engineers or helps the thought push forward the idea of the need of revolution. And one of the individuals murdered was an African Native American / Native American by the name of Crispus Attucks. Why is he not referenced as often? Because throughout the annals of American history, Black folk were not seen as human. There were Black men who literally found themselves going to war and coming home to America and being lynched in their uniforms. It was Martin Luther King in their Have a Dream speech And we got to analyze that. Why is it that we only know the I Have a Dream speech out of the 2,500 or so speeches that King essentially addresses? Why is it also that we only know really the end of the speech where he does this peaceful kumbaya moment where he talks about black children and white children holding hands and coming together? By the way, he only deviates to the I Have a Dream portion because of the fact that Mahalia Jackson, a gospel singer who I traveled with him, had heard this speech before in Michigan, and she saw with her wisdom, they need to hear that speech, they need to hear that part, and she echoes, tell them about the dream, Martin, which speaks to the fact that it was a dream, almost a fantasy, if you will. But why do we only know the last portion and not this piece? Martin Luther King towards the beginning of the speech says this: in a sense, we've come to our nation's capital to cash a check. When the architects of our republic wrote the magnificent words of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, they were signing a promissory note to which every American was to fall heir. This note was a promise that all men, yes, black men as well as white men, let me add women, because sexism was definitely prevalent in this speech as well, would be guaranteed the unalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It is obvious today that America was defaulted on this promissory note. Insofar as her citizens of color are concerned, instead of honoring this sacred obligation, America has given the Negro people a bad check, a check which has come back marked insufficient funds. But we refuse to believe that the Bank of Justice is bankrupt. We refuse to believe that there are insufficient funds in the great vaults of opportunity of this nation. And so we've come to cash this check, a check that will give us upon demands the riches of freedom and the security of justice. We have also come to this hallowed spot to remind America of the fierce urgency of now. And so the picture becomes more crystallized and clarified. The idea is that there's a framework, though. See, what separates America from elsewhere is, fortunately, there's a framework. And so within the First Amendment of the Bill of Rights, it says that we have the right to peacefully assemble so that we can protest. It says that we have the right of freedom of speech. And so when you see people gathering together, willing to die, because King does his promised land speech because he knew that he was going to die. Folks in America, people like James Armistead knew it was possible they were going to die. The question is, what are you willing to die for? Number one, are you willing to die for freedom? Number two, but then thirdly, is there a framework that says, give to me what has been promised? This is why 3 words were echoed that became a hashtag and then eventually catapulted into a movement: Black Lives Matter. The reason why it needed to be indicated was because the humanity of African Americans had not been adhered to, but because we have a right to protest, we see people willing to put their lives on the line and blood on the streets because a framework exists that says we can demand these rights. And so I end, because it's about to be 15 minutes, with the words of the philosopher that is J. Cole. All we want to do is be free. All we want to do is be free. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Professor Jean Bart. That was wonderful. I'm just going to open the floor now to our question and answer moment or segment. We ask participants to be respectful towards each other and to ask clear and concise questions. So what you may do is just type your information in the comments or the chat section if you'd like, or just turn your mic on to speak, and we ask that everyone speak once at a time.